I have the privilege of introducing Anita Dorett, the director at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Anita also worked with ICCR for several years. Prior to joining ICCR, Anita spent 25 years as a corporate lawyer. She has a master's degree of law from Columbia University. And as a fun fact, Anita's father was knighted by the late Pope John Paul II. So Anita, thank you for being with us. Can you start out by sharing with us the work of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks to United Church Funds for giving me this opportunity and for such a lovely introduction. Really happy to be here. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights is an initiative of ICCR. So we're part of ICCR, and we were formed 3 years ago in 2018 when really ICCR felt that they wanted to have a broader outreach to a broader investment community to get more investors engaged on the work that they've been doing. So the Investor Alliance really is about engaging with more investors who are really focused on respecting the fundamental rights of people. So we're really focused on human rights issues, and we are a membership-based and a nonprofit. We focus on investor responsibility to respect human rights, on corporate engagement to really drive responsible business conduct. And we also focus on standard setting activities to ensure that policymakers and governments put in place the relevant frameworks that enable responsible business conduct. Our membership is about 200, and we represent about 6 trillion in assets under management. A lot of our investors are faith-based investors. We have union funds, mainstream funds, foundations, etc. We also have a good mix between investors in the United States as well as in Europe. And we do have, actually our investors go across 18 countries. So we have a few in Asia, Australasia, and South America as well.
This is the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. As a child of the Star Wars generation, that makes me think that the Alliance is on the good side and that we're fighting against the Empire. Is that a correct assumption?
We're fighting for every person's entitlement to live a life of dignity and equality. That's what we're fighting for.
So tell us a little bit about your perspective. You came out of corporate law. Why did you choose to work with investors? What influence do you think investors have when thinking about these powers and empires?
I worked as an in-house counsel for many, many years. And, oftentimes when we were working with our business colleagues, with management, and we were proposing certain ideas, or when we are together really partnering to the business to come up with solutions, a lot of the answers that came back to us, well, if you put that in place, you're not really serving the interests of investors. They are the owners of the company. And so they're really, we always need to be increasing shareholder value. And I know that, and that was something that was drummed in us all the time, right? You have to the business has to conduct itself in a way that increases shareholder value. And we know over the past few years with the Business Roundtable, there has been a move away from shareholder primacy to really stakeholder primacy. But I would say that so that there has been a change there. But when I was working in-house, that was a lot of the messaging that we got. So when I decided to transition my career and wanting to still be involved in the business area, I knew that shareholders had key leverage with businesses. It is who they focus on when they're making key decisions.
You represent an organization that works with investors and will write letters and engage with in-house counsels at these very corporations. Should they be worried when you're reaching out to them? I mean, what are they feeling and what should they be feeling?
I think what I bring to the table, I guess, is to be able to bring an insight of how corporate America, as you call it, will respond to these questions. In fact, as I'm sitting in some of the dialogues and when I hear the answers being provided by some of the general counsels there, so, really tables turned, I can imagine giving those answers. And so often I'm thinking about how can we as investors then ask more probing questions? Or how can we already have the rebuttals, if I need to use this, to those standard answers that are going to be given by corporations, because they're thinking about one, liability issues, reputational issues. They're also trying to give you answers that they think you want to hear, to project the best, view of themselves. And what we're trying to say, hey, companies, we are looking at long-term shareholder value. We're part of you. We're your owners. We want to grow with you. And we want to bring our experience to be able to enrich the company. So don't necessarily try to impress us, try to work with us. And so by having that perspective, I think that what I can do is try to think about, as I mentioned before, answers to some of those standard responses to really probe further, and also to inform companies that investors are not here for you to kind of manage. We're here to engage and partner with you.
When you chose to join ICCR, you not only chose to work with investors, you specifically chose to work with faith-based investors. I mean, faith and values investors. So can you say anything about the role that you see faith investors having in this process?
I mean, faith-based investors are the trailblazers in fighting for what they believe in. So I think that, always working with faith-based investors or faith-based players means that you're really working at the cutting edge. People who've already started thinking forward about how they want to put their values into action, into what they represent. So, ICCR was built out of faith-based investors wanting to take a position relating to the call by Desmond Tutu out of South Africa. So you've been trailblazing this for such a long time. So it was a real privilege to be able to get that opportunity. So you set the stage, and what you see is other investors seeing the leadership that faith-based investors have brought to the table on issues which now are named ESG risks and issues, but didn't have those names 50 years ago, really leading the investor community there.
It was so great to learn that your father was knighted by Pope John Paul II. So, I mean, he sounds like a really, really bad dude. And by bad, I mean really, really good. Tell us, tell us a story about your father, how he inspired you to do the work you're doing, or how you kind of carry and think about his influence.
I mean, we come from a very strong Catholic family. So my father had always, I think since he was a young boy, always been very much involved in the church. I think what was very distinct about my father's work with the church is that he worked with the St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul very much focused on servicing the underprivileged. And so his focus on his faith and work on his faith was really about service for others. And I think that really inspired all of us. I have 3 other siblings. And around the dinner table together with my mom, we would talk a lot about my father's work, because it took up a lot of his time. So my mom was always complaining he wasn't home enough, but we would have sort of really active discussions. And I think what we took away from that, and this is all 4 of us, is that it was very important for us to really bring our values to life.
In the work that you're doing in China, in the Xinjiang Uyghur region, how has the voices of the people who are being impacted influenced the way you approach the work, and how do you believe they are helping shape this work versus maybe just the headlines that we hear about what's happening?
So on the Uyghur work, we've really been working very closely with Uyghur human rights groups who are also working with victims, and they have families who've been impacted by the actions and the repression in China. And so by that work, we're really enabled to bring the voices of the people on the ground to the table. They don't have a seat at the table. Investors have a seat at the table. So by doing that, we are creating that ability for us to give voice to the voiceless in that particular scenario, and as well ensuring that any kind of action taken by the company is aligned or with what the impacted people want or see needed in that scenario.
Talk to us as investors as why the solar industry is particularly important.
No, that's great. And thank you, Matthew and UCF. You're taking the lead on one of the engagements with the solar company as well. And the issue that we talk about is really the issue of just transition. So as governments and investors and businesses around the world want to address issues of climate change, we're looking at the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So everybody wants that to happen. But we want to ensure that that transition is done in a just way. And what we're seeing, and this particularly comes out from the work that you're already involved in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, what we have found out through research that has come into play is that the solar sector, the manufacture of the panels and the raw materials that go into making these solar panels are actually sourced from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And hence the repression that is ongoing there, the use of forced labor through the detention of people by the Chinese government goes into the making of those solar panels. We're working with investors to engage with their portfolio solar companies in the US, in Europe, who are buying from these tainted supply chains to say, you need to have a conversation on this. You need to change these practices. And where you're not able to change these practices, you need to disengage from them.
So, Anita, are you able to share with us an example of a time where someone on the front lines was impacted and was able to share something or share an experience, a story, share about their lives, and you saw it change the complexion of the conversation?
A lot of what the Investor Alliance work we've been focusing on in the Investor Alliance has been about ensuring that companies have a mechanism in place to address human rights risk, right? And so that's one aspect of the work we do. And the second aspect of the work that we do, and we do this in tandem with ICCR as well, is to look at how then with that mechanism in place, they can address human rights issues. So one example of something that has sort of happened sort of more recently is relating to surveillance technology. So one of the areas that we've been sort of focusing on is the tech companies and the use of technology, which has indirectly led to a lot of impact, negative and adverse impact on people in terms of their surveillance capabilities. So what we saw last year, and I mean, this is not what the Alliance has done, this is really what investors have done. So this is really investor success, but through investor dialogue, through the work of NGOs that as well has complemented that, we've seen companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon, for example, stop selling facial recognition tech. That's in the case of IBM, and in the case of Microsoft and Amazon, putting a moratorium on selling that technology until there are safeguards in place to ensure the sale of such products are done in a way that's rights respecting. So that happens from the work that we do with investors, but investors really bring that to the company and one of the stakeholders that have really pushed for that kind of transformation.
Well, how would you define a success? I mean, what are there any engagements that you would point to that the Alliance has had and say that was a successful engagement? We saw change happen?
And I think one of the issues as well that we, talked about was the issue relating to ICE and their impacts, or I guess, the work or the orders that they were given in relation to immigration and the issues around family separation. And one of the things that we did work on with investors is really to raise the responsibility of companies that are enabling ICE in order to really look at the immigration population that enable that family separation. So we brought those issues up across different organizations, from detention facilities and private prisons. And this work, again, was done with, ICCR, to data companies like Palantir, Thomson Reuters, who are managing this data and providing this data to ICE, to also working with civil society organizations like Mi Gente, for example, and bringing all those pieces together to raise that awareness amongst investors, thus then engaging with companies. And we've seen that change, the change not just at the company level, but also at policy level.
So Anita, on your website at the Alliance for Human Rights, there's a blog post, and it reads, "Global brands must comply with international human rights law." So tell us, what do you mean by that? What are you saying that global brands must comply with international human law? What does that mean to a lay investor? Talk about that for a bit with us.
One of the things that we're pushing with global brands is to say that, you're now a global company. You're operating in markets around the world. You can't just decide to operate in a particular market based on the national laws of that country, which might be less onerous or less rights respecting than maybe even the laws in your own country that you came from. So there's a disparity between national laws, and we don't want companies to be able to play that and work on the lowest common denominator. So you want to use internationally recognized standards. So if you're whether I guess you're a global company or not, but primarily with global companies, you want them to really be looking at global standards. International human rights law is that standard. International human rights laws give people the right. And that's the right that we want to champion for.
I want to thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your important work with our audience today. Thank you.